Late in 1944, the skies over Formosa carried the tired, metallic scent of a war nearing its final pitch. High above the coastline, a Japanese Zero broke into a spiraling, evasive turn, the same maneuver its pilots had relied on since the first clashes over the Pacific. The pilot felt the familiar pull of gravity, the tight rotation that turned his cockpit into a centrifuge of confidence. For 3 years, this move had frustrated American marksmen. It bent geometry in favor of the Zero, leaving pursuers firing into empty air. To him, it was as close to invincible as instinct could be. Behind him, a Marine Corsair rolled into the chase. Its bent wings flashed briefly in the sun, and then its guns opened. Tracer fire stitched across the sky, but something was different. Instead of arcing behind the twisting Zero, the rounds seemed to anticipate the turn itself. They curved, not in truth, but in effect, into the exact point the Japanese pilot was racing toward. In a heartbeat, metal met mathematics. The Zero erupted into flame, torn apart by a burst that should have passed harmlessly behind it. Survivors from the escorting formation struggled to make sense of what they had seen. Their radios crackled with disbelief, fragments of voices trying to explain the impossible. The Americans, one pilot reported after landing, have found a way to bend bullets. It was half joke, half warning, but no one laughed, because this was not luck, nor the handiwork of an unusually gifted marksman. It was a pattern they would witness again and again in the weeks that followed. Fear began to drift through Japanese squadrons with every new encounter. Pilots spoke of American fire that arrived from impossible angles, of tracers that seemed to predict their evasions before they were made. Something had shifted in the air war, quietly, invisibly, decisively. But to understand why this single kill sent a tremor through an entire air force, one must step backward in time, to the years when American pilots were the ones struggling to hit a turning target at all. In the early battles of the Pacific, the limits of American gunnery were laid bare. Dogfights unfolded in tight spirals and sudden dives, yet U.S. pilots often found themselves firing at where the enemy had been, not where he was going. Deflection shooting, the art of striking a target in motion, demanded a mixture of instinct, trigonometry, and experience that few possessed in the opening months of the war. The learning curve was steep, and the cost of misjudgment was fatal. Japanese aviators, by contrast, entered the conflict shaped by a decade of intensive aerobatic training. Their pre-war programs emphasized fluid maneuver, spatial awareness, and the ability to judge angles in a heartbeat. In the Zero, a machine that responded as though wired to the pilot's nerves, they executed rolling brakes and climbing turns with a confidence honed long before Pearl Harbor. Each evasion was a lesson repeated, refined, and expected. To them, American fire felt stiff, delivered in straight lines, in predictable bursts, bound by technique rather than instinct. Reports from early clashes described U.S. gunners as mechanical, men who aimed by procedure rather than feel. Against aircraft that danced through the sky, such rigidity left little chance of scoring hits unless the Japanese pilot made a mistake, and the early war Zero pilots rarely did. The aircraft itself amplified this imbalance. Light, responsive, and forgiving in the hands of a skilled aviator, the Zero could twist away from danger with an elegance that seemed to defy physics. Against such agility, the average American pilot struggled to place a single bullet where it mattered. The pattern repeated across the Solomons, the Coral Sea, and the Aleutians, turning fights belonged to Japan. Over time, this performance hardened into doctrine. Japanese planners assumed that their maneuvering superiority and America's difficulty countering it would endure for the duration of the war. It was an advantage built not merely on machinery, but on belief. Yet beneath that confidence, a problem was forming on the Allied side, one no amount of accelerated training could solve in time. And somewhere in the search for a shortcut, the balance of the air war was about to shift. The losses of 1942 and 1943 revealed a truth the U.S. Navy could no longer ignore. Again and again, American fighters returned from combat riddled with holes, or failed to return at all, not because their machines were inferior, but because their bullets so often passed harmlessly behind lightly built, fast-turning Japanese aircraft. Pilots described firing full bursts at Zeros twisting through the sky, only to watch their tracers carve empty arcs. It was not courage they lacked, but geometry. To close that gap, the Navy needed pilots who could master advanced deflection shooting, the kind of marksmanship that required the mind to solve equations at the speed of instinct. But such profi Shinsai took years to cultivate. Time, however, was the one commodity America did not possess. The Pacific was vast, the enemy relentless, and the pace of operations left no space for training programs that stretched across seasons. Every month, the war intensified. Every month, the skill gap remained. In this pressure, engineers and tacticians began searching for what had once been dismissed as ambition bordering on fantasy, a technological shortcut. If the pilot could not be trained quickly enough to match the maneuvering skill of his opponent, perhaps the machine itself could compensate. But early concepts, primitive attempts to incorporate gyroscopic prediction, were fragile, temperamental devices. They struggled under carrier conditions, where salt, vibration, and violent landings punished anything more delicate than steel. Yet the need only grew sharper. By late 1943, it was increasingly evident that the next evolutionary step in air combat would not come from human reflex alone. What was required was a sight that could do the impossible, perceive motion, anticipate turn rate, and whisper to the pilot where to fire before he consciously understood the angle himself. The idea bordered on science fiction, but the mathematics behind it was sound. All that remained was the courage to attempt it. Quietly in workshops far from the front, a radical proposal took shape, a gunsight that did not merely sit atop the instrument panel, but thought for the pilot, translating physics into aim. It was a device many believed could never survive real combat. But its creators knew that if it worked, it would change the Pacific Air War in an instant. And so, in the crucible of urgency, the Gyro Gunsight was born. The breakthrough came not from an American laboratory, but from a group of British engineers working in the uneasy quiet of 1943. Their creation, the Mark IIC Gyro Gunsight, began as an attempt to solve a puzzle older than aerial combat itself: how to strike a moving target in 3 dimensions while both hunter and hunted raced through the sky. The device looked unremarkable, a compact housing of lenses, cogs, and a gyroscope, but within it lay a new way of understanding motion, a way that transformed prediction from a guess into a calculation. At its core was a simple but radical idea. If a gyroscope could sense how the aircraft moved, then the gunsight could translate that movement into the lead required to hit a turning enemy. By measuring angular velocity, the sight learned not only the path of the pilot's own aircraft, but the rate at which the pilot was tracking the target. From those shifting values, it produced a solution: the future position of the enemy. The pilot no longer needed to rely entirely on experience. The sight would supply the mathematics. This knowledge appeared inside the cockpit through a moving pipper, a floating ring that expanded, contracted, and drifted across the glass as the target maneuvered. To pilots accustomed to fixed sights, the effect was unsettling. The reticle seemed alive, shifting with each input, as though tracing invisible geometry across the sky. Yet that motion was the heart of the design. When the pilot matched the target's wingspan to the ring and kept the pipper steady, the sight did the rest. It converted turn rate into aim, time into trajectory, instinct into accuracy. Even so, skepticism was immediate. Many pilots doubted they could trust a reticle that refused to remain still. Instructors warned that dependence on such a device might dull judgment. Engineers worried it was too delicate for the violent landings and salt-laden winds of carrier decks. And tacticians feared that introducing new technology mid-war would create as many problems as it solved. But the US Navy saw something more. Beneath the fragility and complexity lay the possibility of a quiet revolution. If the sight worked as intended, it could erase years of required training, compressing a veteran's intuition into a pane of glass. American evaluators studied the Mark IIC, tested it under harsh conditions, and imagined how it might change the rhythm of combat. Here, finally, was the shortcut they had been searching for. The question now was what aircraft could wield this new power most effectively. And in the dark blue shape of the F-4U Corsair, fast, heavy, unforgiving, they found a machine waiting for a sight that could transform its force into precision. The F-4U Corsair entered the Pacific with the presence of a predator built for a different age. Fast, heavy, and unmistakably aggressive, its inverted gull wings cut a silhouette that seemed to announce strength rather than subtlety. Yet beneath its armored skin and massive Pratt& Whitney engine lay a paradox. The aircraft's very power made it difficult to master. Pilots who first climbed into its cockpit often found themselves wrestling not just an airplane, but a machine that demanded absolute precision at unforgiving speeds. Its armament, 6-caliber Browning machine guns, offered extraordinary destructive potential. When those guns converged on a target, the result was decisive. But the Corsair could unleash that force only if the pilot could deliver rounds into a fast-moving enemy at exactly the right moment. In turning fights or slashing attacks, the difference between a burst that struck home and one that vanished into open sky was measured in fractions of a second. In those fractions, the Corsair's strength became its burden. The aircraft's speed amplified the challenge. It closed on targets so rapidly that traditional gunnery techniques, manual estimation of lead, angle, and distance, became nearly impossible to perform in time. Pilots described the sensation as outrunning your own judgment, reaching firing positions before their minds could process the geometry. Even veterans struggled to place accurate fire against maneuvering opponents. For new pilots, the learning curve rose like a cliff. This was the problem the Gyro Gunsight quietly promised to solve. By translating motion into prediction, it gave the Corsair something it had never possessed: the ability to bring its firepower to bear with mathematical clarity. Instead of guessing at where a twisting zero would be, the pilot watched the moving pipper show where it was going to be. The burden of calculation shifted from the cockpit to the gyroscope. The aircraft's raw velocity, once a liability, now became an asset, allowing pilots to maintain energy while still firing with precision. Slowly, the Corsair began to shed its reputation as a brute force machine. With the gunsight in place, it became something different, something almost paradoxical: a high-speed sniper. The aircraft that once relied on strength now wielded accuracy. Gunnery instructors noted the change in gun camera footage. Hits once considered improbable became routine. The Corsair had found the partner it needed not in new engines or heavier guns, but in a device scarcely larger than a hand. And as these upgraded aircraft returned to the fleet, the transformation unfolded quietly. No announcements, no headlines, only a shift in the balance of combat that few yet understood. Soon, those who faced the Corsair would discover what this new union of power and precision truly meant. The first American pilots to test the Gyro Gunsight approached it with a mix of curiosity and quiet skepticism. Many had spent months perfecting traditional gunnery, learning to calculate lead through instinct and repetition. Yet within minutes of flying with the new device, their hesitation dissolved into something bordering on disbelief. The moving pipper, once dismissed as a distraction, settled into their vision as naturally as the horizon. It felt less like learning a new tool and more like discovering a sense they had always possessed but never used. Gun camera footage confirmed what their instincts were already telling them. Accuracy did not improve by degrees, it multiplied. Bursts that once scattered behind a turning target now struck with cold consistency. The Navy measured the results carefully, expecting modest gains. Instead, they found gunnery performance doubling almost overnight. The change was not subtle. It was as though the aircraft itself had begun to guide the bullets. Perhaps the most surprising effect emerged in training squadrons. Rookie pilots, fresh from flight school, began outperforming veterans who had honed their marksmanship across months of combat. The device erased the usual hierarchy of experience. What had taken a seasoned pilot hundreds of hours to perfect, a newcomer could now emulate in an afternoon. Instructors watched these shifts with a kind of sober awe. The old metrics of talent were dissolving before their eyes. One senior gunnery officer described the sight as a revolution disguised as glass, a simple housing that concealed a transformation in how air combat would be fought. He understood that the machine was not replacing the pilot, it was elevating him, allowing human reaction to merge with mechanical anticipation. In this union, the unpredictable dance of dogfighting became something more controlled, more precise. By late 1944, Japanese interceptor pilots began noticing the change as well. Encounters that once allowed them to slip away through tight defensive turns now ended abruptly. American fire seemed to arrive from angles that should have offered safety. Reports filtered back through squadrons, unnervingly accurate bursts, hits scored during high-deflection passes, and an emerging sense that the Americans were no longer missing when they should. Yet early warnings were met with dismissal. Commanders attributed the pattern to improved enemy training or isolated luck. Few imagined that a device scarcely known outside testing circles was already reshaping the air war. The truth would reveal itself only when the sight left the proving grounds and entered the fleet in numbers large enough to rewrite combat. And as deployment expanded quietly across American carriers, the skies above the Pacific were about to change in ways neither side fully anticipated. The rollout began quietly, almost without ceremony. As American carriers replenished their air groups in late 1944, boxes marked only with technical codes arrived in the hangar decks. Inside them were the new Gyro Gunsights, small, compact instruments whose appearance gave no hint of the transformation they carried. Mechanics installed them into Corsairs and Hellcats between sorties, bolting them into cockpits still warm from combat. By the time many pilots returned for their next mission, their aircraft had changed in ways they did not yet understand. First combat flights dispelled any uncertainty. Pilots accustomed to missing narrow windows of opportunity now found themselves striking targets at ranges and angles they once considered beyond their skill. The adjustment period was brief. The logic of the sight felt intuitive, even natural. When the Pippa drifted, they followed it. When it settled, they fired. And the bullets met their mark with unnerving regularity. Squadron commanders watched accuracy curves climb in a matter of days, not months. As these results accumulated, the U.S. Navy revised its training doctrine with unusual speed. For years, instructors had warned pilots to avoid lingering in turning fights with Japanese aircraft. Such engagements favored the Zero's agility and exposed American fighters to the frustration of missed deflection shots. But with the new sight, the calculus shifted. A turning enemy was no longer a threat to be outclimbed or outdived. It was an opportunity. Pilots were now encouraged to remain aggressive, to use the enemy's maneuvering not as a shield, but as a predictable path the sight could interpret. Gun camera footage from this period became a kind of testimony. Frames once filled with empty ocean now showed rounds walking steadily across an arc and into a darting fighter. Hits captured on film defied the expectations of experienced analysts, bursts landing during high-angle turns, role reversals, and evasive spirals. It was as though a curtain had fallen away, revealing a geometry of combat that had always been present but seldom exploited. For the pilots themselves, the change was deeply felt. The dread of watching a Zero slip through a perfect firing position faded quickly. Encounters that once demanded guesswork now unfolded as controlled sequences, each movement guided by a partnership between human instinct and mechanical foresight. One aviator described the sensation as finally being able to reach the enemy I'd been chasing for 2 years. Another called it flying with the future perched on the guns. The psychological shift proved as significant as the technical one. American pilots, long wary of engaging highly maneuverable opponents in close quarters, approached dogfights with renewed confidence. Their machines felt sharper, their reactions steadier. The cockpit environment changed subtly but unmistakably. Gauges and dials no longer existed in isolation, but formed part of a larger system in which the pilot and the gunsight shared the burden of decision-making. The aircraft became not just a weapon, but a computation engine of war. As these upgraded fighters spread through the fleet, Japanese pilots began encountering an air war they did not recognize. Maneuvers that had preserved their lives since the beginning of the conflict suddenly failed without warning. Reports of strange American accuracy multiplied, though few could explain the cause. The reality was simple yet profound. The technological race had accelerated, and for the first time, Japanese doctrine was falling behind. Soon, they would be forced to confront what this new precision meant, not just in isolated duels, but across entire campaigns. The air war was shifting, and the skies of the Pacific were preparing to expose the new imbalance. Years, Japanese fighter doctrine had rested on a simple and reliable truth. A skilled pilot in a maneuverable aircraft could evade almost any burst of American gunfire. The Zero's light frame and generous control surfaces allowed it to slip through tight arcs and abrupt vertical reversals that confounded traditional gunnery. Evasion was not merely a tactic, it was a philosophy. A turning fighter could survive. A maneuvering fighter could win. In the early Pacific battles, this belief held firm. But by late 1944, disturbing signals began to surface. Pilots returned from sorties shaken, reporting that their usual defensive patterns were failing. Spirals that once carried them out of harm's way now intersected with bursts of .50 caliber fire. Brake turns, executed with the same precision they had practiced since flight school, ended abruptly in explosions of fuel and aluminium. Something in the rhythm of combat had shifted, but few could articulate what it was. The most unsettling, reports described Americans landing hits from oblique and high-angle positions, angles that, according to pre-war training, should have yielded safety. Japanese aviators watched tracers curling across the sky in patterns that suggested anticipation rather than reaction. Rounds struck where they were going, not where they had been. To the pilots at the receiving end, it felt as though the Americans had begun reading their intentions mid-flight. Intelligence officers attempted to make sense of the pattern. Their initial conclusion was a conservative one. The United States must have altered its training regimen. Perhaps returning veterans were instructing new pilots with advanced techniques. Perhaps flight schools had intensified focus on deflection shooting. In an era when technology often outpaced understanding, it was easier to credit human skill than to imagine an optical device silently rewriting the physics of air combat. Yet the statistics told a harsher story. As more American squadrons received gyro-equipped fighters, loss ratios shifted with alarming speed. Units that had once fought the Allies on roughly equal terms now found themselves outmatched in engagements they had previously dominated. The change was not gradual, it was abrupt, almost surgical. Each clash seemed to remove another layer of confidence, leaving young pilots wary of maneuvers they once executed with pride. Veterans noticed the erosion most clearly. The men who had survived years of combat felt the war tightening around them. Their instincts remained sharp, but instincts alone could no longer guarantee survival. Technology had overtaken experience, and the skies they once commanded now felt foreign, less like an arena of skill and more like a battlefield where unseen calculations determined fate. What troubled Japanese leadership was not merely the increase in losses, but the inconsistency in explanations. No captured aircraft revealed any obvious modifications. No intercepted messages spoke of new optics, and the Americans themselves offered no boasts or hints. Their sudden precision appeared almost as a natural progression, an evolution without a visible mechanism. In the absence of clear answers, uncertainty took root. Doctrine that had guided pilots since the 1930s began to fray under the strain of unexplained defeats. Confidence, once the greatest asset of the Zero, slowly eroded. Japanese aviators entered combat no longer certain that their maneuvers would save them. Fear, once rare among elite squadrons, crept quietly into the cockpit. But the Americans were only beginning to understand what the gyro sight allowed them to do. In ready rooms across the Pacific, Corsair squadrons were refining tactics, adapting their entire approach to a weapon that turned movement into opportunity. And soon, the full potential of this new way of fighting would reveal itself. As the gyro gunsights spread through the fleet, Corsair squadrons began to sense that their aircraft no longer fought by the old rules. Pilots who once hesitated before committing to high-speed attacks now leaned into them, using velocity as both shield and weapon. The Corsairs' preferred engagement shifted towards slashing strikes, fast, decisive passes that exploited gravity, altitude, and momentum. These maneuvers demanded precision at the very moment when closure rates were highest, a task once considered nearly impossible. But with the gyro sight guiding their aim, speed no longer obscured opportunity, it clarified it. In these new engagements, the sight revealed its true value. During steep turns or rolling maneuvers, moments when the human eye lost its bearings, the Pipper remained steady, translating chaos into geometry. Pilots described the sensation as though the gunsight was seeing the fight a split second before they did. A Zero diving away in a corkscrew pattern, once a near-guaranteed escape, could now be caught in a brief, deadly window of predicted motion. The Corsair, no longer needed to mimic the enemy's agility. It only needed to understand it. This shift revitalized energy fighting, a style of aerial combat rooted in altitude, acceleration, and momentum rather than tight turning. The Corsair, with its powerful radial engine and heavy frame, excelled in this domain, but without accurate gunnery, energy tactics often resulted in fast, clean misses. The Gyro sight finally closed that gap. A diving attack that lasted 2 seconds could now produce a hit. A high-speed zoom climb could still deliver a burst at the moment before separation. Energy fighting became not just viable, but overwhelmingly effective. Doctrine evolved as quickly as the technology. Ready room chalkboards filled with new principles, pull the pipper, instructors said, and trust the sight. Pilots learned to maintain the aircraft's performance envelope, letting the gyroscope handle the mathematics of lead. This partnership between instinct and computation became the new rhythm of combat. The transition marked a cultural shift, as well away from the belief that victory rested solely on a pilot's innate talent, and toward the idea that mastery required understanding a system larger than oneself. The results were unmistakable. The U.S. Navy's gunnery supremacy ceased to be an occasional advantage and became a systematic feature of air combat. Engagement after engagement confirmed that American fighters were striking targets under conditions previously regarded as outliers. Intelligence analysts reviewing gun camera footage realized they were witnessing a structural transformation, not a string of fortunate encounters. The data reflected what pilots already sensed. The Gyro sight had turned probability into consistency. For Japanese aviators, the loss of their historic defensive advantage carried deep psychological weight. Maneuvers that had saved lives since the earliest days of the war now failed with alarming regularity. Their aircraft had not changed, their skill had not diminished, but the enemy had found a way to neutralize the one refuge they trusted most, the sanctuary of movement. In this new environment, evasion no longer meant survival, it meant exposure. Across the Pacific, frontline reports echoed the same quiet realization. The balance of air combat had shifted, not through a new fighter design or an increase in numbers, but through an optical device small enough to fit in one hand. And as the months progressed, this device would not merely influence individual duels. It would shape the outcomes of entire campaigns. For the war's final acts, the question would no longer be whether American pilots could hit a maneuvering target. It would be how far this new precision could carry them. When American carrier groups sailed toward the Philippines in late 1944, their pilots carried into battle a confidence that felt different from anything they had known before. It was not bravado, nor the momentum of prior victories. It was the quiet certainty that, for the first time in the Pacific War, their accuracy would match their courage. The Gyro gunsight had begun as an experiment, then a curiosity, and finally a revelation. Now, over the islands of the Central Pacific, it matured into a decisive instrument of war. The Japanese air arm entered these battles under very different conditions. Aircraft production had dwindled. Training programs, once rigorous and selective, were reduced to a matter of weeks. Squadrons consisted of a shrinking core of veterans surrounded by young aviators whose skills were shaped more by necessity than by mastery. The asymmetry was stark. One side ascended through technology, the other declined under the weight of attrition. In that imbalance lay the tragedy of the war's closing year. In the skies over Leyte and Luzon, gyro-assisted bursts began to carve unmistakable patterns into the conflict. American pilots no longer needed prolonged tracking to score hits. A quick pipper alignment, a controlled burst, and a maneuvering Japanese fighter dissolved into fragments. What had once required instinctive judgment now unfolded as a practiced equation. Pilots described the sensation as finally having time to aim, time to think, time to live. The sight did not make them fearless, but it made fear manageable. This precision mattered beyond traditional dogfighting. As kamikaze attacks intensified, the need for instant, accurate fire grew desperate. Diving attackers offered only seconds of engagement, their paths unpredictable and their intent absolute. Yet the Gyro sight gave American interceptors the ability to lead these plunging aircraft with newfound clarity. Corsairs holding defensive screens around the fleet struck incoming threats with clinical timing, breaking attacks that might have otherwise reached the carriers. In the chaos of a kamikaze raid, where every second changed the fate of ships and crews, prediction became salvation. Japanese commanders, reviewing loss reports, confronted a truth they could scarcely reconcile. Aircraft shot down in tight turns, fighters destroyed mid-spiral, kamikazes intercepted at angles previously considered unreachable. Engagements that should have favored their maneuverable aircraft instead ended swiftly and decisively. The doctrine that had once shaped an empire's air strategy, maneuver to survive, was failing before their eyes. The new American accuracy was not an anomaly, it was a system. As the campaign shifted toward Okinawa in 1945, this imbalance grew even more pronounced. The skies above the Ryukyus became a proving ground for the Gyro site's full potential. Corsairs rotated through combat air patrols with an efficiency that blurred the line between technique and inevitability. Gun camera footage from the period captures a somber rhythm, a pippa settling, a short burst, and a flash against the sea. What had begun as a tactical advantage now reshaped the nature of air superiority. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, the collapse of Japanese air power was nearly complete. The few remaining veterans sensed that the war they had prepared for, the duel of instincts, reflexes, and maneuver, had slipped into history. They faced an enemy whose weapons could anticipate motion in ways no pilot, however skilled, could fully counter. The balance of air power had not simply shifted, it had been overturned. And in the final year of the Pacific War, Japan would discover that technology, quiet, compact, and nearly invisible, was about to overwhelm doctrine entirely. By late 1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase defined by desperation from above. The kamikaze, an aircraft transformed into a weapon by the will of its pilot, introduced a threat unlike anything the U.S. Navy had faced. These were attacks measured in seconds, a sudden dive, an accelerating silhouette, and a narrow window in which a defending fighter had to react, align, and fire. The geometry was unforgiving. A slight miscalculation meant a carrier struck, a destroyer torn apart, a deck consumed by fire. The problem was not courage, it was time. Manual gunnery struggled to match this new reality. Traditional sights demanded a stable picture, a moment of prediction, a breath of calculation. But kamikazes did not offer moments, they offered instants. A pilot trying to lead a target diving at nearly 400 miles per hour faced a task bordering on the impossible. The slightest hesitation turned the attacker into a blur that streaked past the guns and vanished into the ship's silhouette below. Even experienced aviators described these engagements as battles fought against instinct itself. The gyro gunsight changed that dynamic the moment it entered the fight. Where the human eye faltered, the sight anticipated. Where reflex strained, the gyroscope measured. In the cockpit, the pippa moved with uncanny precision, shifting ahead of the attacker as though the weapon understood the dive before the pilot did. Interception paths that once required mental arithmetic now unfolded almost intuitively. A defending fighter needed only to pull the pippa across the target and fire. The sight transformed seconds of panic into seconds of control. Corsairs and Hellcats equipped with the gyro sight became the fleet's shield. Their interception rates climbed sharply, and the difference was visible across the naval task forces. Pilots reported making shots they would never have attempted months earlier, high lead bursts fired at nearly vertical attackers, rounds meeting their targets in narrow cones of sky just moments before impact. What had once been a frantic chase became a sequence of guided engagements. The mathematics of survival had shifted. As a result, American ships lived. Carrier decks that might have been pierced remained intact. Flight operations continued. Destroyers maintained their screens. In the vast ledger of the Pacific War, the gyro sight did not appear as a weapon of destruction, but as a mechanism of preservation. It saved ships, aircraft, and lives by giving defenders the precision necessary to counter a tactic designed to overwhelm them. In every successful interception, there was a quiet moment when technology bent the balance away from catastrophe. Yet this new shield was visible not only in American successes, but in Japanese frustration. Aviators tasked with kamikaze escort missions returned with troubling reports. Their attackers were being intercepted earlier, more consistently, and at angles that defied pre-war understanding. The defensive perimeter around the U.S. fleet had thickened, not through numbers, but through accuracy. Many Japanese pilots could not articulate what had changed, only that the Americans now seemed capable of answering dives once thought unstoppable. For those who had spent their careers mastering the art of aerial maneuver, this realization carried a weight heavier than fear. It signaled a turning point, an irreversible shift in the nature of the conflict. Skill, once the heart of Japanese doctrine, could no longer overcome the American advantage. The sky itself seemed to have adopted a new set of rules, rules written in the spinning core of a compact device mounted above the guns. And as the war drew toward its final chapters, Japanese aviators began to sense the full scale of this transformation. The weapon they could not see, the one they could not identify in combat, was shaping their fate with each passing sortie. Ahead lay the moment when the truth would come fully into view. By the final months of the war, the skies over the Pacific had grown strangely quiet. Japanese air units that once launched with confidence now flew with hesitation, burdened not only by dwindling numbers, but by a mystery they could not solve. After-action reports spoke of American accuracy that bordered on the unnatural, bursts that anticipated turns, volleys that struck from oblique angles, and pilots who seemed able to read an opponent's next move before it happened. Yet no one could explain how. The pattern defied every lesson they had been taught. When the war ended and Allied intelligence teams began interviewing Japanese aviators, a consistent thread emerged: confusion. Many pilots believed the United States had implemented a new, elite training program, one that produced marksmen capable of performing complex deflection calculations under extreme pressure. They imagined classrooms where angles of attack were drilled as rigorously as formation flying, or instructors who demanded perfection in a discipline that took years to master. To them, this was the only explanation that made sense. No machine, they assumed, could account for such precision. These assumptions began to unravel only after the war, when captured officers were shown the small, unremarkable device mounted on recovered American aircraft. The Gyro gunsight, with its compact housing and shifting pipper, appeared almost too simple to have played such a decisive role. Some pilots stared at it in silence, trying to reconcile the calm mechanics of the device with the deadly accuracy they had faced in the air. Others expressed disbelief, open, unguarded, and deeply human. One veteran reportedly murmured, "We never saw this, and we never stood a chance." For decades, Japanese air strategy had hinged on pilot skill, on the belief that mastery of maneuver, discipline, and instinct would always defeat mechanical solutions. But the gyro sight overturned that assumption with ruthless efficiency. It transferred the burden of calculation from the pilot's mind to a gyroscopic core spinning unseen inside its casing. In doing so, it shifted the technical advantage to the Americans with a speed that no training program could match. In a single year, the foundation of Japanese aerial doctrine was rendered obsolete. The realization carried a deeper lesson, one that extended beyond the cockpit. Technology, when paired with the willingness to adapt, could accelerate faster than talent alone. It could erase long-held advantages, rewrite the balance of combat, and redefine what was possible in the air. The collapse of Japanese air power in 1945 was not merely the result of dwindling resources or inexperienced recruits. It was shaped by a weapon they never identified in flight, a device they did not even know to fear. In the end, their confusion became a symbol of a broader truth. The war they had trained for was not the war they fought. Maneuver, once the purest expression of aerial skill, had been outpaced by prediction. And by the time the Japanese air arm understood the nature of the weapon turned against them, the outcome had already been decided. Ahead lay the consequences of this shift, a new era in which machines and pilots would merge more closely than ever before, and where the future of air combat would be shaped not just by instinct, but by the quiet logic of a gyroscope. Even as the Gyro gunsight reshaped the air war, it did not grant immunity. American pilots still launched from carrier decks knowing that many would not return. They flew into storms of flak, intercepted bombers at close range, and faced opponents who, though increasingly outmatched, remained deadly. Technology sharpened their aim, but it could not protect them from fire, collision, or the unforgiving ocean below. The Pacific remained vast, and war remained indifferent. For every victory captured on gun camera film, there were names that never reached the debriefing rooms. On the other side of the conflict, Japanese pilots faced a different burden. Many entered combat with only a few dozen hours of flight time, far less than the veterans who had once defined the Zero's reputation. They climbed into aircraft that were often poorly maintained, sometimes underpowered, and always outnumbered. Yet what confronted them was not merely superior numbers, but a level of accuracy they could not evade. Maneuvers that had promised survival in earlier years now ended abruptly, leaving them little time to understand what had changed. The tragedy lay not in their lack of courage, but in the widening gap between human skill and technological force. This asymmetry created a moral tension that lingered long after the war ended. The Gyro gunsight was necessary, few would argue otherwise, but its effectiveness revealed an uncomfortable truth. The line between advantage and inevitability can become thin. Battles once decided by instinct and maneuver now hinged on the silent rotation of a gyroscope. Pilots who once relied on artistry, on the feel of lift in a turn, or the intuition of timing a burst, found themselves operating within a system that demanded less interpretation and more compliance. Air combat was no longer purely personal. It was increasingly mathematical. Yet within that shift lay the future. The Gyro gunsight was not merely a tool, it was a precursor. It foreshadowed an era in which the pilot and the machine would operate as a single decision-making unit, each one extending the capabilities of the other. The cockpit became a space where human judgment and mechanical prediction converged, redefining what it meant to fight in the air. For those who lived through it, the change felt both empowering and sobering. Empowering because it saved lives, sobering because it hinted at a world where technology would forever accelerate faster than tradition. As the Pacific Campaign pushed into its final months, this integration of man and machine accelerated the war's conclusion. American forces advanced with increasing momentum, supported by fighters that could intercept threats efficiently and consistently. Japanese resistance, though fierce, could not offset the advantages created by precision gunnery. Each battle reflected the same pattern: fewer opportunities for escape, fewer uncertainties in engagement, fewer doubts about the outcome. The war's tempo tightened, and with it, the end approached. But beneath the statistics and the strategy lay a quieter truth: progress carries a cost. The Gyro gunsight helped restore balance to a war that had once seemed poised against the Allies, but it also marked the beginning of a new philosophy of combat, one where prediction overshadowed improvisation, and where survival depended not only on training or courage, but on the unseen machinery inside the cockpit. In the years that followed, air forces around the world would study this transformation closely, recognizing that the future of flight had shifted irrevocably. Ahead lay the doctrines and technologies that would build on this legacy and reshape the next generation of aerial warfare. The end of the Pacific War did not mark the end of the Gyro gunsight's story. In many ways, its true influence began only after the shooting stopped. Engineers and tacticians stood. The conflict realized that a profound threshold had been crossed. For the first time in aviation history, a machine inside the cockpit had calculated the future more quickly than the pilot could perceive it. Gyroscopic computation, once a niche experiment, had proven that prediction, not just reaction, could shape the outcome of aerial combat. This principle became the foundation for modern lead computing sites. As jet aircraft entered service in the late 1940s, their speed made manual deflection shooting nearly impossible. Pilots closing at hundreds of knots needed more than instinct. They needed instruments that could keep pace with the physics unfolding around them. Designers looked back at the Gyro gunsight not as a relic, but as a blueprint. The mathematical logic behind its shifting pippa became the heart of new systems built to withstand the vibration, acceleration, and temperature extremes of the jet age. By the early Cold War, the lineage was undeniable. American fighters such as the F-86 Sabre carried gunsights whose internal principles traced directly to the wartime Mark IIC. British and Commonwealth aircraft adopted similar technology. Even nations that had once underestimated the device now sought to replicate it. Post-war air forces dissected U.S. gun camera footage, studied captured components, and revised their training doctrines. They recognized that the sight had not merely increased accuracy, it had redefined the relationship between the pilot and the aircraft. As these technologies matured, the concept evolved again. Gyroscopic prediction merged with radar assistance, allowing gunsights to track targets at greater distances and through cloud or clutter. What had begun as a mechanical solution became an electronic one, and soon afterward a digital one. The logic remained the same: calculate future position, simplify the pilot's task, and convert fleeting opportunities into decisive outcomes. As missiles entered service, their targeting systems inherited the same mathematical heritage. The weapon no longer needed to be pointed manually. The machine would determine where the enemy would be, not where he was. This progression reshaped maneuver warfare itself. Dogfighting became less about outturning an opponent and more about denying him the predictive advantage. Vertical maneuvers grew in importance. Energy management replaced tight spirals as the defining metric of survival. The pilot's world, once governed by intuition and the feel of wind over the wings, shifted toward an era where information, computation, and timing mattered more than raw dexterity. The human element remained essential, but it was now embedded within a larger technological ecosystem. In this evolution, the Corsair acquired an unexpected legacy. It became more than a powerful carrier fighter. It became the symbol of a transitional moment in aviation history. The aircraft that once relied on brute strength and raw speed became the proving ground for a device that changed how pilots engaged the enemy. Its cockpit, tight, rugged, and surrounded by steel, was the stage on which humanity and machinery first fused in a meaningful way. Pilots who flew the Corsair in 1945 were among the earliest practitioners of a new kind of aerial warfare, one that relied on cooperation between instinct and computation. This legacy endured long after the Corsair's wings fell silent. Every modern fighter, every heads-up display, every radar-computed firing solution, every targeting system that predicts instead of reacts, carries a thread that leads back to a small gyroscope mounted above 6.50 caliber guns. It is a reminder that the most influential weapons of war are often not the loudest, but the quietest. They shift battlefields not by force alone, but by altering the rules under which force is applied. And as these innovations spread across nations and generations, they prepared the stage for the final reflection, the deeper question of what it means when machines begin to see the future more clearly than the pilots who guide them. At the beginning of the Pacific War, Japanese pilots believed they understood the nature of aerial combat. Maneuver, fluid, disciplined, instinctive, was the highest expression of a fighter pilot's craft. Machinery, they argued, could be copied, improved, or replaced, but human intuition was irreplaceable. A pilot who mastered the turning fight could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast any opponent. It was a philosophy shaped by years of training and reinforced by early victories, where the Zero's grace and agility made evasion feel almost effortless. In those first battles, instinct appeared to triumph over brute force. But as the war unfolded, a quiet contradiction emerged. The Gyro gunsight revealed that while instinct remained essential, it had limits that a carefully tuned machine could extend. For the first time, a device inside the cockpit processed motion faster than the human brain could interpret eye. T-turn rate, angle, acceleration, and closure became not just sensations felt through the controls, but calculations rendered into a single shifting pipper. In that moment, computation outpaced instinct. The sky did not cease to reward skill, but it began to reward a different kind of skill, one that embraced prediction rather than reaction. Corsair pilots felt this shift intimately. Many had trained for combat defined by intuition and raw determination. Yet the gyro sight did not replace their courage, it refined it. It channeled their discipline into a narrower margin of error, where every burst carried intention. With the sight, they could honor the risks they took each time they launched from a carrier deck, giving their bravery a precision that matched its depth. They became marksmen not by surrendering their instincts, but by extending them through a spinning core of metal and mathematics. For Japanese aviators, the change was abrupt and merciless. The Zeros lost great advantage. The power to evade by maneuver vanished almost overnight. A brake turn once guaranteed survival. Now it became the prelude to a waiting burst of fire. The flicker of a moving pipper abolished the sanctuary that maneuver had offered for years. Battles once shaped by fluid, human judgment shifted toward a new geometry in which the machine's predictions left little space for escape. The dogfight, as it had been known since the dawn of aerial warfare, began to fade. In this transformation lay a profound irony. The Pacific Air War had started as a contest of reflex, instinct, and individual mastery. It ended as a contest of prediction. Technology did not eliminate the pilot's role, but it redefined it, forcing aviators on both sides to confront the reality that courage alone could not alter. The future of air combat belonged to those who could integrate with their machines, who understood that survival would depend as much on computation as on intuition. As the war closed, the legacy of the Gyro sight lingered quietly in the minds of those who had faced it. It marked a turning point not only in the conflict, but in the philosophy of flight itself. The device was small, almost unimposing, but it carried within it the seed of a new era, one where the partnership between human and machine would guide the evolution of aerial warfare for generations. And in the final accounting of the Pacific struggle, its role remained unmistakable. It was the sight the Japanese never saw coming, because by the time they did, it was already aiming at them.